Okay, so we have our database set. We have our database table. So now we need to take our application and build out our data access layer, our database utility class. So what I'm going to do is right click on my solution, choose add, and I'm going to add a new project. I'm going to add a class library, and this will be midterm review SQL utility. So I will delete that class out. And then I'm also going to go ahead and add another project, class library, midterm review core. And I'll delete that class. So in the core, I'm going to add a user object. So right clicking on the core project, add class. I'm going to call it user. And make my class public. And then I'll do properties for all of my fields. I think that's everything. And my two date fields. All right. So now I have my class. That's in my core. I'm going to add a reference to my core. So right click on references in my SQL utility, go to solutions, projects, check off the core, hit OK. So that adds my core reference. I'll now right click on my SQL utility project and say add class. This will be my SQL user utility. So I'll make this class public, get that set up. So I need to put a few member elements in here. I need to define a constructor, and in that constructor I'm going to be passing in the connection string that this connector will use. I'll need to create an add method, an update method, a delete method, and a get all method. So I'll need those 4 methods. And since this is SQL Server, I like to create private methods that allow me to create the connection object without having to hand code that each time. And then I'll probably build 2 mappers. So I will map from SQL Reader, and that'll take my SQL Reader and give me back a list or a collection of user objects. Then I'll add one more that will be build parameters. And what that'll do is I will give it a user object, and then it will return back to me a collection of SQL parameters, and it'll do that mapping for me. So I don't have to actually manually key in my SQL parameters every time. I just give it the object, and then it gives me back a collection of parameters built out and set. All right, so the constructor, it'll take in a name, and this will actually be, let me say, connection string name. And we'll add a private member of connection string name with the underscore, and then we'll just store that. That's all we have to do. So we'll do public user. Whoa. add my using statement, add user. This will be my template. And I'll just add a not implemented exception in there for now. Public user update user. That'll be our user object to update. And then public void delete user. That'll be our user to delete. And then public list of user, get all users. So those will be our method stubs. So then this will be private DB connection, get connection. And DB connection is a base class that is used by all of the ADO.NET or database connection objects within the .NET framework. So if at some point I wanted to take this and not make it SQL Server specific, but make it more database agnostic or independent, I can do that. And that'll throw a not implemented exception. This private list of user map from SQL Reader. This will take in a SQL data reader and return a list of users. And then this build parameters will return a DB parameter collection, and this will take in a user. Okay, so those are our methods that we'll need within the utility. So let's start with get connection. Before we do that, though, we need to actually bring in that connection manager, that system.configuration library. So we'll right-click references, add reference. I'm doing this to the SQL utility, assemblies, and I'm going to do system.configuration. So now from get connection, I can say SQL connection con equals new SQL connection con dot connection string equals system dot configuration manager dot connection strings. And let me do this just to make it easier to see and read. Let me get rid of the namespace, and I'll just add the using. So now it's just configuration manager dot connection strings, square brackets, and I'm going to pass the name of the connection string. So that's inside of underscore connection string name, and that's actually a connection string settings object that gets returned. So that object has a property called connection string. So we're just going to pull that. And that'll be the connection string that we put in the app config later. So even though it's not there, we know it will be there, so we can act and work like it will be there. So we've now set all that up. So now we can simply return con, which is our connection object. Let's go ahead and build out a couple of these methods. So get all users. We'll need a list of user. We will need a SQL connection, which actually it'll be DB connection. We'll call get connection. We'll need a DB command, and I'll say con dot create command. So that will give us our command object for our connection, and it'll set our connection as the default. And then our command text will be select all from user, because that's our table. So that's our line of SQL. And then we'll say cmd.execute reader, and that will give us back a DB data reader. So this is our variables. This is our SQL setup. And then this will be execute query. There's actually a few things I missed here. We need to put a try catch block in. We need to open our connection, execute our reader. This will be the catch part of our try catch, and then I'm just simply going to rethrow. Now there are two ways of throwing an exception. You can do throw and then throw an exception object, or in this case I can just say throw without saying EX, which is my exception object. Does anybody know the difference? Huh? You'll get an error message in both cases. The difference is that if I simply call throw without an object, remember that stack trace we looked at a couple weeks back that actually showed us where the error was occurring? If I just call throw, then the original stack trace is maintained. If I call throw and pass EX, I'm essentially throwing a new exception, and the stack trace will only fall back to the point at which I throw the object. So basically, think of it this way. If I throw and then if I do throw EX like this, then that stack trace will point back to this line of code and say that's where the exception occurred. But that's not actually the case. The exception occurred somewhere else, and we want to be able to walk it all the way back. So you want to just do this so that you can walk it all the way back. Now, if you're trying to hide where the exception actually occurred, which maybe you do. If you have a web application, you may have exceptions that you're not handling and you want them to throw because you want the user to know that something happened. But you may not want them to go all the way back to your SQL connection string and your SQL statement that you're running, because now you're giving them information about how your environment is set up that they could use for malicious purposes. So you may want to rethrow a new exception to mask the original exception and try to keep a level of security around your infrastructure. So something to think about. Those things aren't always obvious at this point in time when you're writing code, but the first time you see it happen on a production web server where all of a sudden your SQL code is all spewed out in ugly red and yellow, you realize quickly that you need to go back and make some adjustments. So it'll happen. All right, so we'll catch and then throw so that we can trace it back. But it allows us a good point so we could actually insert a breakpoint here and then see what kind of issues or errors we may run into. So we'll take, back under the try, we'll take our reader, and then we'll say map from reader, and we'll pass in our reader. And the problem we're going to run into here with this red error is that my reader is a DB data reader, but my map from SQL is expecting a SQL data reader. So what I'll just do is replace it. SQL data reader, if I jump into this is a meta abstract of the SQL data reader class. It's not the actual code, but it's kind of like an interface. It's just Visual Studio looking at the public members of that class, and then it generates this pseudo code for you. It doesn't actually run. It doesn't actually work. You'll even see in the upper right-hand corner where the file name is, it says SQL Data Reader from metadata. So it's just giving you kind of an abstract. But the piece that I like is that it'll tell me the inheritance chain. So SQL Data Reader inherits from DB Data Reader. It implements iData Reader, iDisposable, and iData Record. So you can have variables of any of these types and store the SQL Data Reader object inside of that variable of any of those types. So in this case, since SQL Data Reader inherits DB Data Reader, we can just put DB Data Reader there and we're in good shape. So this will actually give us back a list of users. We have a variable up here called all users, so we'll say all users equals this. And then the final steps will be the return. And I'll say if all users is null, return a new list of user. Else, return all users. I'll set this to null. Now the reason I'm doing that is that I want to provide a collection in any case. I don't want to return null. I want to give back a collection even if it's empty. So if I don't get one from map from SQL data reader or whatever, I still want to return back a list even if it's empty. That's my goal. All right, so this method needs to be implemented. The map from reader. And inside of here, we'll need a list of user. And we're going to do a while statement. So while the reader is reading, while we're getting data from the database, this will be our user DTO or data transfer object, which is just another user object. I'm just calling it DTO. And then we're going to go ahead and fill this in. So reader, and this will be date created. Cast it to date time. Date modified. A string for email. String for first name. This will be an int. Sure, we'll take password. We'll say new list of users there, semicolon, and then we'll say users dot add user DTO. And then once we're done with the loop, we'll return users. So that'll do our populating.